Hi everyone, tonight we're going to peel back the stiff woolen layers of a world you've probably only seen in oil paintings and Thanksgiving school plays. You know the look: tall black hats, stern faces, somber clothing that seems better suited for a funeral than for founding a new world. But what if I told you most of that's a myth? Right now, imagine it's a humid July morning in 1632. You're in Massachusetts Bay Colony. There's no breeze and your underarms have given up entirely. You're wearing wool, everyone is. There's no cotton, no linen, at least, not for common folk like you. The sun is already cooking your bonnet like a baked apple, and you haven't even finished feeding the chickens. Welcome to colonial fashion. Hot, itchy, and nothing like the black and white fantasy you learned in grade school. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started on tonight's journey together. You shuffle out the door of your timber frame home. It is not a longhouse or a cabin, it's a half-finished box with drafty planks and a stubborn squirrel living in the roof. But you've got bigger issues. You're already sweating through your doublet. The thing's got stiff sleeves and wooden buttons that dig into your collarbone every time you bend over. You glance at your neighbor. She's wearing 3 skirts and something that looks suspiciously like a doily on her head. So why all the layers? Partly it's tradition. Mostly it's because clothing is expensive. You don't have closets. You have a dress, maybe 2, and you wear them in rotation until they fall apart or get repurposed into baby clothes, or, if you re-lucky, curtains. Despite the stereotype, Puritans weren't walking around in head-to-toe black. That kind of fabric was hard to dye and hard to keep looking clean. You wore earth tones, really browns, tans, grays, maybe a faded green if you were feeling spicy. Black? That was for formal portraits, funerals, or extremely judgmental neighbors. Historians still debate whether the idea of black equals pious came from real practices or just from 19th century nostalgia art. But either way, the average Puritan wasn't dressing to impress God with their gloom. They were dressing to survive the weather, the work, and each other's opinions. Here's a fun wrinkle. Wool was the go-to fabric, but it was imported or homespun, scratchy, thick, and uncooperative. There's no cool, breathable anything. You couldn't just head to the general store and pick up something light for summer. Even linen was pricey, and cotton didn't really arrive in quantity until later. You wore what you had. And what you had was basically sweat insulation. And let's not forget, laundry was serious work. No washing machines. Just boiling water, wooden paddles, and elbow grease. You didn't wash your clothes often, you just wore underlayers and hoped for the best. Spoiler alert, everyone smelled. If you were lucky, you aired things out on the fence and hoped the wind did its job. The fashion wasn't just about covering up sin, it was about survival. Skirts doubled as aprons. Cloaks were basically mobile blankets. Even your bonnet served a purpose, keeping the sun off your head and your neighbors from asking if you were feeling okay. But even here in the heat and hardship, there were subtle ways to stand out. Maybe a lace trim your aunt smuggled in from England. Maybe a dyed sash that used up your one luxury, imported woad. Maybe you stitched a little flower into the hem small enough that your minister wouldn't see it. Or maybe he did. And maybe that's why you got side-eyed during communion last week. Oh, and about that hat. The tall black one with the silver buckle? Total myth, no one had buckles on their hats. That image came much later. In reality, most folks wore flat, floppy felt caps that lost shape faster than boiled cabbage. Buckles were expensive and hard to make, so you fastened your shoes and belts with lacers or just tied them awkwardly and hoped for the best. One man's vanity was another man's punishment. The minute you looked like you were trying too hard, someone would say you were stealing a station, that is, dressing above your social class, and yes, they would tattle. Gossip was basically colonial social media. And here's your odd fact of the night. In some communities, people were fined for wearing too much clothing. That's right, too many petticoats, that'll be 2 shillings. A hat with trim? Better be able to prove your income. Imagine being ticketed for accessorizing. Meanwhile, some wealthier settlers had fancier clothes they kept locked away for special occasions, usually church. So yes, the one day you were expected to look your best was the day you were also supposed to be the most humble. If that sounds confusing, it's because it was. One sermon told you to adorn thyself with modesty, and the next week, someone got called out for wearing an old tunic that looked too ragged. You literally couldn't win. As you head to the village center to trade a few eggs for salt, you feel the sweat pool in the small of your back. Someone nearby smells like boiled onions and damp wool. It's probably you, but you nod politely. Because out here in the Massachusetts sun, piety may be measured in prayers, but it is also measured in how many layers you can wear without collapsing. And so, the confusing wardrobe of America's first Puritans was less about holiness and more about weather, wealth, and wool. Nothing matched, nothing breathed, and nothing was simple. But that was the point. It was meant to humble you, to wrap you in discomfort, to remind you every hour of every sticky summer day that vanity was sin. And sin was always waiting for someone with a little too much trim on their sleeves. You wake up the next morning in the same shirt you wore yesterday, maybe even the day before. It's a little damp around the neck, smells faintly like wood smoke and cabbage, and sags in the elbows from too many wearings. You stretch, roll out of your straw mattress, and get dressed for another long day in the colony. But here's the thing: how you get dressed and what you choose to wear might be saying a whole lot more about your soul than you think. At least, that's what everyone else believes. Welcome to the spiritual minefield that is Puritan dress code. Every stitch, every hemline, every ribbon is sending a message, whether you want it to or not. Because in this little village of saints and sinners, the clothes on your back might as well be shouting your moral status to the entire congregation. Puritans were obsessed with modesty, but not in the way you might think. Sure, you weren't supposed to show too much skin, but really, the whole point was to show restraint. That meant no luxurious fabric, no excessive decoration, and definitely no newfangled styles from Europe, which were viewed with deep suspicion. Especially anything French. French meant lace, and lace meant sin. But here's the hilarious part. Many Puritans, especially those with money or merchant ties, couldn't help but dress a little nicer than necessary. Nothing crazy, just a finer linen, a sharper collar, a stitched pattern that caught the sunlight a little too nicely. And when they did, they made sure to explain it away, with lines like, "This was a gift," or "It belonged to my uncle before the Lord took him." You know, just humble enough. One Massachusetts minister went off in a sermon about women who dared wear gold rings, saying they might as well dance upon the grave of righteousness. Harsh, right? But even that didn't stop folks from sneaking in a touch of flair. A hemmed cuff here, a blue-dyed cap there. Historians still debate whether this behavior was hypocritical or simply human nature. After all, these were people trying to carve out a new life in a brutal, uncertain world. Maybe a little self-expression wasn't vanity, it was survival, emotional armor in wool form. Now, let's talk about the layers of meaning built into these clothes, especially among the godly elite. These were the folks who made a good living off land or trade and wanted you to know they were favored. But not too favored. So they walked a tightrope between humble piety and humble brag. Their outfits were like coded sermons, modest yet somehow expensive, plain yet finely tailored. You could spot the difference up close. It was like when someone today says, "Oh, this old thing?" And you just know it cost more than your month's rent. Here's a fun detail. When Puritan communities took in new members, their appearance was noted. A man might be questioned not only on his theology, but also on whether he dressed appropriately for his condition. Too rich looking, you're vain. Too poor looking, you're lazy, Goldilocks level just right. Now we're talking sanctification. And women had it even harder. Their clothing had to walk the tightrope between being attractive enough to be seen as a suitable wife, but not so attractive that it was seen as a snare. Which meant no bright colors, no lace collars, no high heels. Yes, high heels did exist at this point, though good luck walking on Colonial mud paths in them. Honestly, even your dreams wore sensible shoes. But don't worry, everyone was watching everyone. Town gossip was a full-time job. If you were too sharply dressed for Sunday service, the minister might mention prideful adornments in his next sermon, without naming names, but everyone would turn and look at you anyway. And yes, Sunday best was absolutely a thing. You wore your nicest clothes to church, not just out of reverence, but also out of fear. If you didn't show up looking neat and tidy, people might think you were struggling or worse, sinning. One woman was dragged before the elders for wearing a velvet hood, which was considered above her station. She swore it was second-hand. The court still fined her. This brings us to a deeply odd fact. Clothing could be inherited, like a family name or property. Your grandfather's doublet might become your wedding coat. A widow might wear her late husband's cloak to signify both mourning and modesty. And if someone was accused of vanity, their clothes could even be confiscated as evidence. Imagine a courtroom trial. For your socks, you shuffle along the muddy path to your neighbor's house, passing two boys wearing the same patched breeches they've worn since Michaelmas. You nod to a woman with perfectly pleated sleeves and wonder how she managed that. With no iron, she probably has one of those hot rocks from the fire she uses to press it, or maybe she's just that devout. Sleeves like those don't wrinkle under sin, right? There's a deep-rooted idea here. Your outward self reflects your inward condition. So even if your clothes are simple, they better be clean. If they're worn, they better be mended. And if they're new, you better have a really good excuse. Bonus points if your excuse includes divine providence. Even children weren't safe from judgment. Young girls wore tiny versions of adult gowns, modest, stiff, usually in browns or grays. Boys wore skirts until about age 5 or 6, when they were breeched, in a little ceremony that made it clear childhood was over. Time to start acting like a miniature adult, itchy wool and all. And through it all, people tried to maintain appearances. Because appearances were theology. And theology in Puritan New England was everywhere from your hat to your hemline. So next time you look at one of those old-timey portraits and think, wow, they must have been so pious, just remember, somewhere a deacon was side-eyeing a ruffle. A shoemaker was grumbling about unpaid debts, and a poor soul was probably getting hauled in front of the town elders for wearing a slightly too shiny belt buckle. You're crouched in the corner of your dim little home, trying to tie your garters without falling over. It's early, your joints are creaking louder than the floorboards, and you're already regretting that extra cup of cider last night. You grunt, stand up, and reach for your breeches. But as you hoist them up, you mutter a prayer of thanks, not for breakfast, not for survival, but because you don't have to wear a codpiece. Yes, the codpiece. That infamous medieval clothing item, part armor, part awkward billboard, was very much a thing in Europe, but by the time the Puritans got to America, it had finally gone out of style. Praise be, you're welcome. The codpiece, for those mercifully unfamiliar, was a padded pouch sewn into the front of a man's trousers to cover and, well, highlight his groin. Originally functional, it quickly became ornamental. Some were even jeweled. Historians still debate whether this was fashion, fertility signaling, or just an extreme case of mine's bigger than yours. But Puritan men in the New World weren't into that sort of flashy anatomy advertisement. They preferred plain-fronted breeches, often tied at the waist and the knee with ribbons or cord. Not decorative ribbons, God forbid, but sturdy, practical ones. Trousers came to just below the knee, where stockings took over, held up with garters. Underneath, you'd wear a linen shirt tucked in at the waist, the universal base layer for all respectable folk. Here's the part they don't teach you in school. These linen shirts were your underwear, your pajamas, and your undershirt all rolled into one. You owned maybe two, maybe. And on wash day? That shirt hung on a line like a flag of surrender to filth. In the meantime, you just kept wearing it and hoping the smell of wood smoke masked everything else. As for jackets or doublets, they were fitted, padded, and usually made from wool or heavy linen. Think of them as part vest, part armor. They were practical, too tight sleeves for movement, short bodices for working in the fields, and reinforced seams so the whole thing didn't fall apart when you lifted a sack of barley. And then came the cap. For men, this meant felted wool in either flat caps or short-brimmed hats. Remember those dramatic pilgrim hats with big silver buckles? Fabrications. No one had shiny buckles on their hats unless they were fabulously wealthy or incredibly vain, and neither of those things played well at the next town meeting. Still, every item told a story. A neat, well-fitting doublet? Prosperity and discipline. Torn stockings? Perhaps misfortune. A clean shirt with embroidery on the cuffs. Scandalously close to vanity. Even the buttons could be controversial. Wooden or cloth-covered buttons were fine. But if yours were pewter or heaven help you mother of pearl, expect someone to pray for your humility at the next church gathering. Historians still debate how strictly these unwritten dress codes were enforced. Some communities, like the one in New Haven, Connecticut, were notorious for regulating personal appearance down to the inch. Others turned a blind eye unless someone really overdid it. You know, like showing up in imported velvet. Or worse, French velvet. But the real trick was making do. Tailors were few and far between, and most folks mended their clothes themselves. That meant your coat got patched, your breeches were turned inside out after one too many tears, and your hat might be handed down from your grandfather. Tailoring wasn't about fashion, it was about preservation. Let us pause for a genuinely strange fact. Archaeologists once uncovered a 17th century shoe buried in the wall of a Puritan home in Massachusetts. Why? Well, turns out it was a folk superstition. People believed hiding a shoe in the wall could ward off evil spirits. No word on whether the spirit was fashion related. Now, if you were feeling fancy, say you were a merchant or someone pretending to be one, you might own a cloak. Not a swishy vampire number, mind you. Just a basic wool drape, often dyed a muddy brown or green, lined if you were lucky. Cloaks were useful, especially in the brutal New England winters. But wear one too nice and suddenly you were setting yourself above your brethren. You head outside again, brushing off a bit of straw from your sleeve. Across the village square, you spot Samuel, the miller's son, looking awfully sharp in his new jerkin. It's short, sleeveless, and edged with what might be decorative braid. Scandalous, you nod politely. But the expression on your face says, we'll be discussing this at dinner. Meanwhile, women are dealing with their own fashion dilemmas, but we'll get to that in the next part. For now, let's focus on how every man walking around town is a walking sermon. Not in a look how holy I am way, but in the quiet, constant pressure to not stand out. And yet, stand out they did. Even among the most modest Puritans, you'd find someone wearing just a little too much sleeve padding. Someone with a hat a bit too high. Someone whose shirt was so white you had to ask, did he bleach that thing? That's luxury. That's dangerous. Because in Puritan New England, clothing was never neutral. It was either humbling or prideful. It either confirmed your place in the world or questioned it. And if your wardrobe whispered anything above a respectful mumble, you might just find yourself whispered about at the next meeting. So tonight, as you settle into your straw-filled mattress and unlatch your doublet with fingers stiff from work, take comfort in knowing that at least you don't have to wear a codpiece. The bar may be low, but sometimes that's enough. You're in the meeting house on a sleepy Wednesday afternoon, trying not to nod off while Elder Winthrop drones on about fence disputes. It's warm. Too warm. Your back itches, your coif is tight, and you swear the wool from your neighbor's collar is shedding in your direction. You glance down at your hands that just finished kneading dough, scrubbing linens, or maybe even assisting in a birth earlier this morning. And there they are, ribbons. Because here's the thing. In Puritan society, even a ribbon could land you in hot water. Not literal fire, though. If you lived in the wrong place at the wrong time, maybe. These people were serious about their distrust of adornment. Lace? Suspicious. Satin? Absolutely not. Buttons? Only if they served a very obvious, very modest purpose. Let's talk about collars and coifs first. You're probably wearing one or both. A collar, stiff and white, was expected. The whiter, the better. It didn't matter that bleach hadn't been invented, you boiled it with lye. And hoped your arms didn't fall off from scrubbing. It was a sign of order, cleanliness, godliness. A dirty collar meant a disordered life. A little lace on the edge? That's skating the line, sister. That could get you talked about. And the coif? That was your cap. Women wore them at all times unless they were in bed or freshly widowed and wearing a morning hoed. Some were plain. Some had tiny embroidery tucked in near the edges, like secret tattoos for the devout. But let someone catch you with a feather tucked in it? That was practically declaring war on the Community Standards Board, which is to say, everyone with eyes. There's an odd historical record from Boston, 1653, where a woman named Sarah was called before the magistrates because her bonnet ribbons were too scarlet and too wide. Not modest, not torn or too short, but just too red. Historians still debate whether this was really about the ribbon ... or about Sarah's general vibe. Either way, her punishment? Public repentance and a warning that further vanity would not be ignored. You can practically hear the Puritan HR department filling out the paperwork. But here's the kicker. Many of these sinful accessories were worn in secret. Think of them as the colonial version of rebellious eyeliner hidden just beneath the sleeve, or pinned inside the bodice where no elder would look. There's one delightful diary entry from 1671 that mentions a young woman who sewed blue thread into her petticoat hem because the Lord may know me by the color I favor. Whether that was fashion or prayer is still up for debate. Probably both, and then there were the buttons. Buttons were practical. Buttons held things shut. But God help you if they were decorative. Metal buttons, questionable, gilded buttons. Theological disaster. In fact, some towns actually banned them unless you could prove your income matched your outfit. Try explaining that at the town meeting while everyone stares at your coat. Odd fact time, some Puritan communities preferred hooks and eyes over buttons entirely. Why? Because they were less flashy, less tempting. There's a church record from Plymouth noting that hooks are more godly than toggles, which sounds like a bad joke but was apparently a serious ruling. Imagine going to confession over your fastening system. And if you were caught flaunting? That's when the phrase, the devil's ribbon, might get thrown around. It wasn't a specific item, really more like a catch-all insult for anything too fashionable, too decorative, too French. Ribbons, lace, bright threads, anything unnecessary. If it made your neighbor purse her lips and whisper, vanity, congratulations, you were now on unofficial fashion probation. Historians still debate how much of this was about genuine belief and how much was just good old-fashioned social control. Because let us be honest, clothes were one of the few ways to signal status in a society that theoretically rejected hierarchy. Theoretically. So when someone showed up to meeting house with perfectly pleated cuffs and clean shoes, everyone noticed. And not always kindly. Let's shift to men for a moment. They weren't exempt from the style police. A man's cuffs, collar, hat band, even the shape of his breeches could all signal either piety or pride. There is a court case where a man was fined for wide cuffs with embroidery unbecoming a man of his station. Imagine being fined for having too much wrist flourish. Tough crowd. And that brings us to fashion as resistance. Some folks, especially younger people or recent immigrants, pushed back quietly, subtly. A slightly too wide ribbon, a blue-dyed cap, a bit of lace that could be tucked away during sermons. These weren't outright rebellions, they were tiny acts of individuality in a world obsessed with conformity. You might not own land, you might not vote, but you could sneak a forbidden thread into your hem and feel for a moment like you were still your own person. You walk out of the meeting house, eyes on the ground. A gust of wind blows your skirt up just slightly, revealing the tiniest trim of blue stitch. It's gone in a flash, but someone saw. You feel it. Tomorrow morning, someone will casually mention modesty during prayer. Maybe they'll name you, maybe not. Either way, you'll spend the next week wondering if it was worth it. And it was. Because deep down, even in this wool-clad world of restraint, people still wanted to be seen, not praised. Not exalted. Just seen as themselves. Ribbon and all. It's Sunday morning and you're already running late. The meeting house bell hasn't rung yet, but the whole village knows what time it is. You grab your best bodice, the one without the mysterious grease stain, and yank it over your linen shift. The sleeves are stiff from last week's lye soak. Your skirts rustle like dry leaves as you layer one over another. You're sweating, your child is crying. And you still can't find your clean apron. Because even though it's the Lord's Day, a supposed day of rest, it is also Fashion Judgment Day in Puritan New England. That's right, church was more than worship. It was a runway, a somber, wool-draped, uncomfortable runway. And every person in that meeting house would be looking. Not at your soul, at your stitching. You trudge down the dirt path, your shoes thudding against stones. The heels are worn and the left one leans to the side. You'll hear about that later. Your bonnet's a little crooked, but straightening it will have to wait until after you wrestle your youngest into the pew. Inside, the room is cold, long wooden benches, narrow windows, a pulpit that towers like a judge's bench over a sea of discomfort. You lower your eyes, pretending to pray, but you're doing what everyone else is doing, scanning for signs of sin. Who's overdressed? Who looks suspiciously clean? Who's wearing velvet? Historians still debate whether Sunday dressing was about status or survival. Likely it was both. For many Puritans, this was the only time all week when they weren't working, when they could put on the one outfit they tried to keep nice. It didn't matter if it was just a cleaner shift or stockings without holes. This was your presentation. Not to God, he already knew your flaws, but to everyone else. The problem was, the line between presentable and prideful was thinner than your bonnet ties. Take Mary Parsons of Northampton, for example. In 1674, Mary showed up to worship in a gown dyed deep red. Not crimson, mind you, that was the color of sinners and scandal. But this was a muted red, somewhere between rust and shame. Still, someone said it was excessive, and before the week was out, Mary was summoned to explain why she wore such a riotous hue. Her defense? It had been gifted to her by her cousin in Boston. Whether that cousin was real, no one knows. Odd fact, there was no such thing as pew rental, and early Puritan churches' seating was assigned based on status. The elders and longtime residents sat up front, often with nicer benches. Newcomers and lesser folk were crammed in the back near the drafty doors. You could chart a family's reputation by how close they sat to the pulpit. Fashion was judged from the pulpit, but the pews were the scoreboard. And children, they sat separately. Boys and girls in opposite lofts under the watchful eye of the tithing man. His job was to ensure everyone behaved and stayed awake. Yes, he had a long stick with a feather on one end and a knob on the other. Feather for women, knob for men, one to nudge, one to thwack. But back to your clothes. You adjust your collar. It's plain white linen, but the hem has a subtle cross stitch, just enough to look neat, not enough to look decorative. You're holding your breath. Because across the aisle, Deacon Phillips is squinting at you, not in reverence. In judgment. Is it the stitch? The bonnet angle? Or did someone mention your apron was a little too new? The Puritans didn't have mirrors in every home. They had public opinion, and it was relentless. Here's the catch. Everyone knew you were supposed to wear your Sunday best. But what if your best was better than someone else's? Suddenly, your attempt at dignity was a temptation. Men were warned in sermons not to let their eyes wander to bright thread and bosom lace. One minister even declared that a collar too wide is a doorway to the devil. Seriously. That guy probably hated embroidery with a vengeance, and yet people still tried. They tried to look clean, neat, respectable, not because they were vain, but because they were human. Because even in a world where pride was punished, shame was worse. Some women passed down their best aprons for generations. They dyed them with walnut hulls or indigo if they could afford it. Some used onion skins to give their fabric a golden glow. All of it was subtle, cautious, a little flair, camouflaged in piety. And still they were watched. There's a lovely weird bit of folklore that says if you wore the same dress to 3 Sabbaths in a row without a visible repair, people assumed you were showing off. It wasn't enough to look neat. You had to look like you were trying not to look neat. The mental gymnastics are exhausting and very, very Puritan. You make it through the sermon. The Psalms, the announcement that someone's goat escaped again. You stand. Kneel, sit, stand again. And when the bell rings for dismissal, you file out slowly, nodding to your neighbors. You catch a faint compliment. That shawl looks ... durable. You smile, knowing that's the highest praise you'll get this month. So yes, Sundays were holy, but they were also theater. And the costume design? Unforgiving. Because in Puritan New England, you dress not just to worship, but to survive the judgment of the living, just as much as the judgment of the Lord. You're stacking firewood when the knock comes. It's not a friendly knock. It's the kind of knock that says someone saw something. You open the door slowly. Standing there is Elder Mather, hat in hand, mouth already pursed like he just tasted sour milk. "A word, if I may," he says, eyes darting toward your sleeves. Uh-oh, did he see the lace? No, can't be that you only wear that on feast days. Maybe the shoes. Are they too shiny? You should have scuffed them, because this isn't a neighborly visit. This is a fashion inspection. Welcome to the world of sumptuary laws, colonial rules meant to make sure nobody, and I mean nobody, dressed too nicely for their own good. You thought fashion police were just a joke? Oh no, in pure New England they were real. And they took their job seriously. Sumptuary laws were regulations designed to restrict what people could wear based on their social class, income, and morality. In theory, they were about modesty and religious humility. In practice, they were a very public way of saying, know your place. Let's get into it. These laws weren't unique to the colonies. England had them too, but the Puritans brought them over with extra enthusiasm. In Massachusetts Bay Colony, for instance, laws passed in the 1630s and 40s explicitly banned people from wearing lace, silver, gold thread, or silk coats unless they had a certain income or rank. If you were caught violating these rules, you could be fined. Or worse, publicly shamed. Historians still debate how strictly these laws were enforced. Some records show they were mostly symbolic warnings against extravagance, but other cases? Oh, they got real. Like the tailor who stitched a client's coat a little too fashionably. The client, just a humble farmer, was called before the magistrates. The charge, wearing slashed sleeves. That's when fabric is cut and layered for show. The poor guy insisted he had no idea. He just wanted to look sharp for his daughter's wedding. The court fined him and the tailor. And here, as the odd fact of the section, you could be fined for someone else's outfit. That's right. If your spouse or child dressed above their station, it reflected on you. One father in Salem had to explain to town elders why his teenage daughter had embroidered stockings. His defense? They were a gift from her cousin. Classic move. It didn't work. He paid the fine. These laws extended beyond clothing. Shoe buckles, hat bands, even spurs could draw attention. And yes, one man was dragged into court for wearing silver-tipped spurs. On a Sunday, what kind of outlaw energy is that? But who decided what was acceptable? Usually, a group of elders or magistrates-men with strong opinions and often slightly nicer clothes than everyone else. Convenient, right? They'd assess your wealth, your family standing, and your intent. If they thought you were trying to look more important than you were, bam, you were stepping above your station. And it wasn't just about vanity, it was about social control. In a world without strong central government, fashion became a battlefield for keeping order. Your neighbors didn't just judge your soul, they judged your sleeves. You trudged back into your home, heart pounding. Elder Mather didn't fine you this time. Just a warning. Something about your buttons catching the light too brazenly. You nod, promise to replace them with wooden toggles. He nods back, satisfied. A tiny win for modesty. But here's the irony. The people writing and enforcing these laws? Many of them ignored them when it suited them. Ministers wore fine linen. Governors had imported cloaks. There's even a record of a Puritan leader caught wearing French gloves. Scandalous. When called out, he insisted they were a necessity due to hand ailments. Right. Historians still debate whether the laws ever really worked. People kept sneaking in their little flourishes, hidden ribbon, dyed thread, a patterned lining no one could see. You weren't allowed to stand out. So people started getting creative about standing out just a little. Let's zoom out for a second. These laws tell us a lot about how much the Puritans feared chaos. They were trying to build a holy society in an unfamiliar, often terrifying land. Disease, starvation, native resistance, harsh winters, every day was unpredictable. So they clung to control. And what better to control than how people looked? Dress was order, uniformity was comfort. And individuality? That was dangerous. You head to the market the next day wearing your oldest smock. It's plain, dull brown, patched at the elbows. No one will say anything about it. But as you pass by the baker's daughter, you notice a faint shimmer on her sleeve. Blue thread, just a line of it hiding in the seam. You don't say anything, but you smile. Because even in the most rigid corners of the colony, people were still people, still curious, still quietly rebellious. And the sumptuary laws? They could try to iron out everyone's personality, but thread has a funny way of slipping through the cracks. You're in the dyeing shed, surrounded by bubbling pots that smell like something between scorched cabbage and foot. Steam curls through the rafters. You've got a stick in one hand and a hunk of damp wool in the other, and you're trying not to get splashed, because that deep indigo color you're working on might as well be dangerous. Yes, colors could be sinful, and not just because they were loud. In Puritan New England, color had moral weight. The wrong hue could signal pride, extravagance, or something even worse, vanity. A subtle green might say practical merchant, but a bright yellow? That was bold. That was suspicious. That was almost cheerful. Let's unravel this a bit. The classic image of the Puritans has them cloaked in black and white, looking like they've just come from a funeral or a chessboard. But the truth? Black clothing was incredibly expensive. Achieving true, deep black dye required costly materials like logwood or iron salts, and it faded quickly. Only the wealthiest folks could afford black garments that didn't turn purplish-brown after a few washes. Most common folk were earth tones, browns, grays, muddy greens, faded blues. These colors were cheaper to produce and easier to maintain. Dyes came from local plants, roots, and even insects. You'd crush walnuts for browns, onions for gold, and madder root for red. Some recipes called for a little urine to help set the color. Fun, but red, that's where things get heated. Because red was controversial. Not all reds, mind you. A dull rust was fine. A rose or brick red could pass if it wasn't too vibrant. But anything close to scarlet? That was the color of sinners, of harlots, of people who might say, laugh too loudly or have strong opinions at dinner. One Boston widow, Abigail, was dragged into court after wearing a crimson petticoat to market. She claimed it was dyed with beet juice and that it faded quickly. The elders claimed she was leading the town's young men astray. She was fined 5 shillings and ordered to wear only grey to church for the rest of the year. Historians still debate whether this intense color coding was more religious than political. Some say it was about maintaining spiritual order. Others point out that it conveniently kept lower classes from appearing as well-dressed as their betters. Because in the colony, even a bold sash could imply you were getting above your station. Let's take blue next. Light blue? Innocent, sky-colored. Sweet for a child, darker blues, a little edgier. Indigo especially became associated with independence because it was harder to make and often imported. You couldn't get that shade from local plants easily. So if someone was wearing rich blue, you'd wonder, where did they get that? What trade brought it in? What did it cost them? Even green had layers. A dusty olive green was fine forest-friendly, work-ready, but a bright green skirt? That could get you some looks. In fact, there is a story out of Plymouth Colony where a young girl was told she walked like Eve in her vanity simply for wearing a sprigged green shawl. Harsh, odd fact. Some towns actually listed banned colors in their local ordinances. In one 1640s Massachusetts town, you could be fined for wearing cinnabar, crimson, or ultramarine garments unfit for one's place. Imagine a world where blue is contraband. And then there's white, the color you think would be safest. But white was tricky. It symbolized purity, sure, but keeping it clean was practically a full-time job. Wearing bright white meant you either didn't work much or had someone else doing your laundry. Not a good look for someone who's supposed to be humble. Plus, certain white garments became associated with vanity and excess, especially lace collars, snow-colored aprons, or elaborate caps. That's why many Puritan women dyed their aprons off-white, a dingy beige that said, "Ungodly, not flashy." You stir the dye pot again? It's walnut today, good for brown, maybe with a gray undertone if you mess it up. You're aiming for that sweet spot between respectably dull and not so depressing. Your neighbor offers to pray for your mood. Your neighbor Martha once tried using cochineal, a red dye made from crushed beetles, to tint a shawl. It came out too bright. She only wore it once. People still talk about it. The beetle blush incident, they call it, and yet some couldn't resist. A bit of color in the lining of your cloak, a ribbon that only peeked out in the wind. A stitch of yellow on the inside hem of your skirt. These were whispers of rebellion. A small reminder that while everyone else was beige on the outside, they were still made of color underneath. Let's not forget that ministers weren't immune either. Some wore black robes with rich linings. Others had fine cuffs, subtle embroidery, or even brass buckles on their shoes. They'd insist it was for the dignity of the pulpit. And so the rules around color twisted in on themselves. It wasn't about what the Bible said. It was about what your neighbors thought they thought you were doing with that green apron and slightly red sleeves. At the end of the day, the message was this: dress like your soul depends on it. But not too well. Because if your clothes started drawing attention, the elders might think your heart was doing the same. You rinse your hands in the dye runoff, watching the brown swirl around your fingers. You think about adding a streak of deep blue to the inside of your bodice. Just a thread. No one will see it unless they do, and even then, maybe it's worth it. You're standing in front of your home, broom in hand, when the traveling preacher arrives. He's wearing black from head to toe, deep, solid black. The kind of black that doesn't fade, the kind you know came from expensive dye. You blink. Your apron is dust-colored, your bodice was brown once, maybe. You can practically feel the contrast, and yet no one says a word. Why? Because clergy dress differently. In fact, they were expected to. That's right. For all the talk about modesty and humility, Puritan ministers were one of the few groups allowed, even encouraged, to dress in a way that stood out. And the rules? Well, let's just say they got a little fuzzy when you were standing in the pulpit. Ministers were spiritual leaders, sure. But they were also community authority figures, mediators, educators, and often the only person in town who could read Latin. So while everyone else scrambled to avoid suspicion over a lace cuff, ministers could walk around in robes that practically whispered, "God and I are close." We share tailoring tips. Their clothing tended to be more formal, often darker in color. That famous black? Not just a fashion choice. It symbolized sobriety, dignity, and education. It also happened to be one of the most expensive dye jobs available. But when the preacher wore it, it was appropriate. When a merchant did, prideful. Neat trick, huh? Let's look at the canonical outfit of a Puritan minister. black cassock or robe, starched white collar, and sometimes a sleeveless overgarment known as a Geneva cloak. The collar might be ruffled or even folded over in a neat white band, and some were fastened with silver clasps. Imagine trying to tie those while lecturing on original sin. Historians still debate whether the ministers were fully aware of how ironic this all was. After all, these were the same men preaching weekly about the evils of vanity and outward show. And yet, there they stood clothed like a portrait, framed against wooden pulpits with freshly scrubbed panels and carefully arranged pews. But again, this wasn't all vanity. There was a functional reason behind the drama. Ministers had to project authority. In a world where everyone thought they were the chosen elect, a black robe told the congregation, "I speak for something bigger than all of us. Also, I aren't today." And people noticed. Children gawked. New settlers whispered. One woman in her journal described her village's minister as a black bird come to deliver holy warnings. Another simply called hers tall, terrifying, and always pressed. But ministers weren't the only ones walking that delicate line between modesty and spectacle. Let's talk about judges and magistrates. In the Puritan colonies, many of the same men served as both civic and religious leaders. When they weren't reading scripture, they were handling disputes about goats, fences, and land, and they too had a look. Judges wore robes often less fancy than their English counterparts, but still distinct. Some wore dark blue or gray instead of black. Others had trim made from dyed wool or even velvet. Yes, velvet. Forbidden for common folks, but apparently fine if you were deciding someone's punishment for velvet ownership. Poetic. Odd fact time. A magistrate in Connecticut was once accused of wearing a satin-lined coat during a drought year. The townspeople were furious. Not because of the coat exactly, but because he wore it to market, not just to court. The coat was later burned in a symbolic act of community purification. Then there were the militia captains. These guys didn't wear robes. They wore leather and wool broad-brimmed hats and sometimes sashes to indicate rank. And that sash, usually red. Bright red. The same color that would have gotten a farmer's wife fined 3 shillings if she'd worn it to Sunday meeting. See the pattern? Authority gave you color. If you were poor and wore yellow, sinful. If you were in charge of the local militia, heroic. It's not that Puritans didn't see the contradiction. They just had a knack for spiritualizing it. Ministers needed dark robes to model gravitas. Judges needed trim to represent justice. Captains needed red sashes to rally morale. But if a shoemaker's wife wore a green petticoat, well, that was moral decay, obviously. So you kept quiet. You nodded respectfully at the preacher's crisp cuffs. You tried not to stare at the magistrate's shiny buttons. You stitched your apron one more time, making sure the hem was just crooked enough to suggest humility. But deep down, everyone knew, the higher you were in the colony, the more fabric you could get away with. And sometimes, just sometimes, a minister would go a little too far. There's a story from New Haven about a preacher who started wearing Spanish leather gloves. Very fashionable, very imported. Very not local. After weeks of whispered unrest, a group of elderly church members approached him and asked whether he might consider returning to plain wool mittens as a gesture of spiritual solidarity. He did, and 3 months later he quietly resumed wearing the gloves, just not to church. That's the thing about Puritans. They meant well, they tried hard. But even in a world built on simplicity, status still found a way to peek through the seams. You watch the minister stride past your house again, black robe swishing, collar starched, boots polished to a holy shine. You adjust your bonnet and glance down at your apron. It's got a fresh patch. You feel a little proud of it. But not too proud. That would be sinful. You're pulling weeds in the garden, apron full of turnips. When you hear the rustling of silk, you freeze. Not cotton, not wool silk. That slinky, whispery sound that doesn't belong in a world of hoeing and hauling. You turn slowly and see her, Mistress Eliza, just returned from Boston, gliding toward the meeting house in a gown that clearly didn't come from any local loom. She looks like a peacock at a chicken convention. This is the moment you remember something people don't out loud in Puritan villages. City fashion is a problem. Because it exists, and it is tempting. Let's set the scene. By the mid-1600s, while most of New England was plowing soil and squinting at sheep, port towns like Boston and Salem were becoming fashion pipelines. Ships from England, the Netherlands, and the West Indies docked every month, offloading barrels of sugar and crates of fabric, trim, buttons, and dye. And once that stuff arrived, it didn't just sit quietly in warehouses. No, it slipped its way into the colonies, even the strictest ones, even the places where a red ribbon could trigger a sermon. Puritan towns weren't immune to import envy. In fact, Boston became notorious for its fashion problems. Records from the 1650s mention young women aping the foolish garb of London and swaggering through the market in Dutch gloves and umpious bonnets. You know you're in trouble when even your hat is unholy. Historians still debate whether these accounts were exaggerated moral panics or accurate reflections of a growing style divide between the countryside and the coast. But one thing's clear, clothes became a way to signal distance from old Puritan values. Mistress Eliza is a perfect example. Her bodice has tiny shell buttons. Her skirt rustles in layers. You're 99% sure her stockings are striped. You wonder, has she become Quaker adjacent? Anglican-leaning, maybe just a little theatrical? Here's the odd fact of this section. A minister once delivered an entire sermon titled "Against the Fringes of the Enemy." It wasn't about war. It was about literal fringe decorative edging on imported sleeves that was, in his words, the devil's thread. But fringe wasn't the only offender. Fashionable imports included silk ribbons, especially from France, which added a whole other layer of suspicion. Patterned calico, seen as foreign and dangerously cheerful. Brass shoe buckles, too shiny, too modern, and too tempting for the average foot. Feathered hats, practically a siren call for scandal. The elders tried to fight back. They passed new sumptuary laws specifically targeting foreign trims and vanities. In 1662, the Massachusetts General Court issued a warning about the creeping influence of foreign dress, unfit for a Christian land. Sounds dramatic, doesn't it? But when you're trying to build a city upon a hill, even the color of someone's cuffs feels like a crack in the wall. The real problem, of course, was trade. You can't grow silkworms in New England. You can't dye indigo easily from local plants. But ships kept bringing these things, and people kept buying them quietly in the back rooms of shops or from travelers whispering about new bolts from London. It was the 17th century version of ordering online and hiding the package before your spouse sees it. And it wasn't just the wealthy who indulged. Servants sometimes acquired cast-off gowns and capes from their employers. Some women dyed plain wool in imitation of finer fabrics. One inventive widow reportedly painted her shoes with walnut juice to mimic imported leather. That's some DIY hustle. Even the children weren't safe. One little boy in Salem was chastised for wearing a coat of too bright a hue. He was 8. He cried. They made his parents promise to dress him in a manner more pleasing to the Lord. That poor kid probably never wore orange again. But let's not pretend the countryside didn't push back. Some villagers began to resent what they saw as urban pride. They whispered about city women who wore lace on the Sabbath or men whose hats were too crisp in brim. There were murmurs that townfolk were becoming English in manner rather than New English in heart. And remember, in the colonies, being English wasn't always a compliment. It often meant lazy, indulgent, and drifting from righteousness. So what did people do? They started making visual choices. Country folks doubled down on coarse cloth and natural dyes. They patched more visibly. They walked past the city imports with their heads high and their sleeves plain. And when Mistress Eliza showed up with a peacock skirt, they smiled politely. Then added an extra line about pride to the prayer roster that week. You finish your turnip weeding and wipe your hands on your apron. Eliza is long gone now, her perfume trailing behind her like a rumor. You shake your head not with anger, but with quiet amazement. How does she keep that dress clean? Does she have help? Still, you can't help it. That shade of green, it was nice. Just for a moment, you picture your own skirts in that color. You imagine walking through the village in something bright, something light, something ... not brown. Then your child yells from the doorway, and the fantasy scatters like chickens from a fox. Back to the dirt, back to the gray, and back to the quiet game of watching fashion, envying it, judging it, and secretly, quietly wanting it. You're huddled by the hearth, mending a sock with a hole big enough to qualify as a window. The fire crackles. Your fingers ache. The wool is rough and the needle's bent, but the sock is one of only 3 good ones left in the house. As you work, you think of something strange, something you don't say out loud too often. Sometimes the people who looked the most pious had help. Let's talk about servants and the unseen labor behind Puritan fashion. In the harsh world of colonial New England, making clothes wasn't just a task, it was a lifestyle. Clothing production started at the sheep and ended at the sermon, and it took dozens of hours to make even one outfit. You had to shear, spin, weave, dye, cut, stitch, mend, and repeat. And if you weren't doing it yourself, you better believe someone else was doing it for you. Enter the servants. Puritan households often included indentured servants, men, women, even teenagers who worked in exchange for food, shelter, and, if they were lucky, freedom after a set number of years. Some were orphans, some were poor English migrants. Some had committed minor crimes. And many of them kept the clothing system running. That finely pleated collar Deacon Wallace wore on Sunday? Made by his servant Martha, who boiled the linen in lye, pressed it with a hot iron stone, and stitched it while squinting by candlelight. The lace trim on Mistress Atwater's cuffs? Added by her servant girl, barely 15, who copied patterns she wasn't supposed to know. Historians still debate the full extent of how much Puritan domestic labor relied on this servant class. While the myth of self-sufficiency runs deep, household records suggest that many of the more elaborate garments were made or maintained by women and girls, who never got credit or clean clothes of their own. Here's an odd fact for you. Servants weren't allowed to wear certain fabrics, even if they made them. Laws and community expectations restricted them from dressing above their station. So a young woman could spend weeks embroidering a wool cloak with silk thread, then be fined if she so much as tried on the finished product. Some towns even had apprenticeship dress codes. A male apprentice couldn't wear boots with heels higher than his master's. A female servant couldn't wear lace caps. Imagine stitching someone's bonnet for 3 days, only to be scolded for tying the bow too nicely on your own. And then there were the enslaved people. Yes, even in Puritan New England, slavery existed. Often hidden behind words like servant or bondsman, enslaved African and indigenous people were present in Boston, Salem, Hartford, and beyond. They labored in fields, kitchens, and yes, in clothing production. Some were skilled weavers, dyers, or laundresses. Their expertise was quietly woven into colonial wardrobes while their own clothing was often minimal, coarse, and dictated by law. In one sad record from 1670s Massachusetts, a black woman named Ruth was reprimanded for wearing an apron too fine for her place. The fabric? Coarse linen. But it was white, and someone thought it looked proud. The contradictions are staggering. Here you had an entire system built on humility and plainness, yet propped up by the hidden labor of people who were never allowed to participate fully in the society they helped maintain. The better someone looked, the more likely it was that someone poorer, younger, or darker had done the hard work of making them look that way. And yet, despite the injustice, that labor was a skill. A craft. Young girls learned to spin by age 6. Boys learned to card wool before they hit double digits. Stitching a hem straight was practically a rite of passage. And in many homes, a servant's skill with the needle could make or break her treatment. A good seamstress might be allowed a little more food. A clever dyer might be spared the worst chores in winter. One diary entry from a merchant's wife mentions her servant girl, Jane, who makes sleeves finer than any I've purchased in town. Another refers to old Elizabeth, a freed woman who still sewed for half the village because none knew color like she did. She'd dye with moss, berries, and something called bog water blue, no recipe, just instinct. And the clothing? It lasted. It had to. Outfits were passed down from older siblings, altered, patched, re-dyed, cut smaller, stitched bigger. A dress might live 5 lives: wedding gown, Sunday best, work smock, apron lining, then finally a rag for cleaning pots. You pause your darning and hold the sock up to the firelight. The wool's uneven, the color's fading. But it will last another winter, maybe 2. That's what matters. Not whether it's pretty, not whether it fits the latest coastal trend. Just that it keeps toes warm. So next time you see Mistress Eliza swish past in a perfect skirt with pleats that lie like prayer book pages, remember, someone boiled those linens. Someone bled from the spindle, someone pressed that bodice with sore wrists and quiet resentment. In Puritan New England, fashion wasn't just about appearance. It was about who had the time, the tools, and the invisible hands to make it happen. And behind every starch-stiffing collar was a story. Probably one involving lye, a bent needle, and a very tired girl whispering a hymn as she sewed. You were waiting in line for salt cod when you spot it, a man walking through the center of town with no hat. None, not even a cap. In a place where hats were as automatic as breathing, this is like seeing someone walk through a sermon chewing gum. You elbow the person next to you, whispering, "Do you see that?" She nods slowly. Scandalous, she murmurs. Absolutely bald-headed. Because in Puritan New England, accessories were optional, they were social armor, and the most important of them all. The hat. Let's start with the men. No self-respecting male over the age of 10 went around without something on his head. Most wore broad-brimmed felt hats, sometimes with a buckle, sometimes plain. These hats weren't just for shade or warmth, they were status markers. A hat told people who you were, how much land you had, and crucially, how much you feared God. And the etiquette? Absolutely rigid. Indoors? Remove it. In church? Off the head unless you're a minister, and even then only during certain parts. Meeting a superior? You better take it off and hold it respectfully. Called to court? You take it off before you even think about stepping inside. Not taking off your hat was seen as disrespectful, bordering on rebellious. In fact, court records show fines for hat wearing in the presence of authority. One young man in Plymouth was charged for neglecting to doff his hat to a magistrate, a scandal that briefly earned him the nickname Top Hat Tom. Historians still debate whether these hat rules were copied wholesale from England or modified to suit New England's unique social rigidity. But regardless, once they landed, they stuck. Hats were sacred, well, not sacred exactly, but very, very serious. Odd fact of the day. Puritans believed your hat could reflect your spiritual discipline. A floppy brim suggested moral laziness. A tall crown hinted at ambition. And a hat that was too new might imply you'd spent money meant for tithe or charity. So if you bought a new hat, you were expected to scuff it up a little. Just to be safe. Now, women's hats, or rather caps and coifs, were a whole different story. Married women wore white linen coifs, often tied beneath the chin. These could be layered with hoods or bonnets, especially in cold weather. And just like men, women were expected to keep their heads covered indoors and out. Hair was not for public viewing. It was seen as intimate, almost dangerous. There is even a sermon from the 1650s where the minister refers to uncovered hair as the devil's net, in which the prideful woman snares her prey. Subtle, so if you were a woman and walked outside with your hair down, that was a statement. Either a medical emergency, a spiritual crisis, or a teenage rebellion about to end in a lot of uncomfortable meetings with the elders. But women found their ways. They added delicate lace trims to their coifs, just enough to be tasteful. Some starched them to perfection, while others embroidered initials inside, hidden from view. One woman in Salem was known to set her coif ties with lavender, which people both admired and suspected was witchcraft. You can't win. And gloves? Don't get us started on gloves. In New England, gloves were a major status symbol. Imported leather gloves with stitching were prized possessions. Giving someone gloves was a big deal, part social gesture, part investment. They were handed out at weddings, funerals, even courtship. Some people left gloves in their wills. But again, not everyone could wear them. A servant with nice gloves? Suspicious. A tanner's wife wearing embroidered cuffs? Bold move. One Boston court case involved a woman being accused of glove pride. Her defense? They were a gift from her sister. In England, classic shoes? Also loaded with meaning. Those shoes were simple leather with wooden soles or flat heels, but the real drama came with buckles. Brass buckles were acceptable if they were dull. Polished? Questionable. Silver? Risky. Silver with initials engraved? Blasphemy. And don't forget garters. Yes, they were mostly hidden, but not always. A brightly colored garter tie peeking out from under a skirt could spark a gossip wildfire that lasted for weeks. One woman in New Haven was reprimanded for lace garters glints during a gust of wind. That's right, weather-induced scandal. And then there was jewelry. Or more accurately, the near-total lack of it. Rings were sometimes allowed, especially wedding bands. But necklaces, brooches, and anything even remotely shiny were frowned upon. Not outlawed in most places, but deeply discouraged. A shiny pendant might be seen as a burden upon the spirit. Still, people tried. A few brave souls wore mourning rings, black enamel bands honoring the dead, sometimes inscribed with scripture. These were just spiritual enough to pass inspection. Others snuck in jet buttons, which glinted just a little in the sun but could be explained as natural stone. And of course, pockets. Hidden inside garments, often tied around the waist under skirts or cloaks. Women carried pins, coins, even tiny mirrors, and sometimes scraps of lace or ribbon to admire privately. You adjust your own bonnet. It's sagging slightly. The ribbon's a bit frayed. You don't mind. But part of you remembers the soft gloves your cousin sent last year. You haven't worn them out of the house. Not once. They're tucked away in a chest, wrapped in linen like treasure. Because sometimes the fear of judgment is stronger than the joy of wearing something beautiful. So yes, the Puritans kept their accessories modest, but they were never meaningless. Every buckle had weight. Every hat spoke a sermon. Every coif was a line of scripture stitched in linen. And you? You carry your simple things with pride. Not because they're flashy, but because they whisper something truer, that you survived another winter, that your hands made something useful, that your bonnet's still here, threadbare but faithful. And that's a kind of beauty that doesn't need silver trim. You're threading a needle by candlelight, squinting hard enough to turn your face into a prune. The candle flickers. The needle slips. You sigh, rub your eyes, and try again. You've been at this hem for over an hour. The stitches are crooked. The fabric is rough. And yet, this is one of the only garments you'll make this season. Why? Because in Puritan New England, clothing took forever to make and even longer to replace. Tonight, let's talk about the real heart of the Puritan dress code. Scarcity, labor, and the painful economics of fashion. You didn't just go to the shop for a new cloak. There were no racks, no sales. No 3-for-1 deals. If you wanted clothes, you had two choices, make them or pay someone dearly to make them for you. And you'd better hope you had access to the raw materials, which weren't exactly falling off trees. Let's break down the process. First, you needed wool or flax. Sheep weren't rare, but good wool required care feeding, shearing, cleaning. Then came the carding combing out tangles with terrifying wire brushes that could double as medieval weapons. After that, spinning, one thread at a time, on a wheel that creaked like it had feelings. Weaving followed on giant wooden looms that took up most of a room. A skilled weaver might make a few yards a day if they weren't interrupted by, say, life. After weaving came fulling, then dyeing, then cutting, sewing, fitting, stitching, hemming, re-hemming, and hoping the recipient didn't grow 2 inches in the meantime. So when someone in the village turned up in a new coat, that wasn't a fashion moment. That was a miracle. This was also a world where most people only owned a few outfits. Maybe one set for everyday work, one for church, and a third usually a hand-me-down for weddings or funerals. Children wore clothes until the sleeves could no longer be patched. And when a shirt finally gave out, it became a rag or a bandage or stuffing for winter boots. Historians still debate whether the average colonial settler truly lived in poverty or just extreme frugality. But one thing's for sure, clothing was a precious commodity. You didn't throw away clothes, you didn't update your wardrobe. You adapted it, tucked a hem, let out a waist, turned a jacket inside out. Yes, that was a thing. If the outside fabric wore thin, you'd reverse the garment and try again. Even thread was scarce. If you broke your needle, it could mean days without stitching. One woman in Connecticut wrote of borrowing thread from 5 homes to finish the baby's wrap. Imagine borrowing thread. Not eggs, not sugar, thread. Here's your odd fact for the night. Buttons were often passed down generations. Yes, buttons. People would remove them from a deceased relative's coat and save them for future use. It wasn't too uncommon to find an entire row of mismatched buttons on someone's vest, each one with a story. That one was Uncle Tabase's. This one was from the governor's visit. That one? Found it on the road in Rehoboth. So the Puritan dress code wasn't just about modesty, it was about survival. The sumptuary laws we talked about earlier, they weren't just moral guidelines. They were economic ones. If a farmer spent a month's income on imported fabric, that could be the difference between making it through winter or not. Flashy clothes weren't just frowned upon, they were dangerous. They signaled poor judgment, wastefulness, maybe even pride. And pride? That could unravel a whole town's sense of order. But still, there was pride of a different kind. The kind that came from making something by hand. From stitching a seam straight, from dyeing a shirt the perfect dusty gray. From knowing your child's coat once belonged to your brother, and your father before him, and that it's still holding together because you fixed it. People got creative too. Old garments were turned into quilts, rugs, and curtains. Worn-out cloaks became baby blankets. Even shoes were patched until they looked like leather patchwork monsters. Some folks even braided old fabric scraps into floor mats. They weren't pretty, but they were warm. And remember, fashion trends moved slowly. There wasn't a new style every season. There wasn't a fall collection. If someone added a new buttonhole style in England, it might take 5 years to show up in Boston, if at all. Most people didn't even know what was trendy. They were just trying to keep their shirts from unraveling. But that didn't mean style didn't exist. People expressed themselves in the smallest ways. A bit of stitching here, a unique hem there. A boy might carve a pattern into his wooden belt buckle. A girl might line her bodice with a hidden swatch of colored cloth, not to show off, just to feel like herself. You finish the hem, it's uneven. There's a spot where the thread doubled back awkwardly, but it will hold. That's what matters. Because in Puritan New England, clothing wasn't about making a statement. It was about making it through. And every stitch was a reminder, you were still here. You're sitting by the fire, warming your hands and listening to the wind rattle the shutters. When the topic turns, as it often does, to someone as unfortunate decision to wear something a little too nice. This time it's young Thomas. He wore a blue waistcoat to Sunday service. Not navy, not workman's blue, but bright blue. Gasps all around. You listen, not politely, and sip your broth. But inside, you can't help thinking, why are we always talking about each other's clothes? And then it hits you. In a world without newspapers, radios, or gossip columns, fashion was the conversation. The outfit was the headline. The dress was the drama. And in Puritan society, public shame was part of the outfit. Let us step into the uncomfortable truth of Puritan dress codes. They weren't just about modesty or morality. They were about control. And control worked best when everyone participated through gossip fines or even full-blown humiliation. In some cases, local courts enforced dress codes with terrifying precision. In 1651, a woman in Massachusetts was fined for wearing silk in a manner unbecoming her station. What did that mean? No one could say for sure. That was the point. The rules were fuzzy enough to be applied selectively. One man was fined for excess ribboning on the Lord's Day. A tailor was warned after making an overly fashionable cut for a local merchant. And one poor soul received an official warning for owning 2 pairs of shoes with decorative tongues. Historians still debate whether these punishments were about morality or just a way for local leaders to flex their authority. But one thing is clear, public image mattered. Deeply. Here's the odd fact of the night. In some Puritan towns, you could be assigned clothing restrictions as punishment. After a moral offense, say, missing church or engaging in vain speech, you might be required to wear only gray, or to forgo lace, or even to leave your hair uncovered for a set period. Imagine sinning, then having to walk around in the 1600s version of a dunce cap made of calico. The idea was simple. Shame works better when everyone sees it, especially in a small town where everyone sees everything. And the flip side? If you dressed too well without earning it, you were assumed to be hiding something. Suspicion spread fast. Where did she get that cloak? Who gave her that ribbon? Is he really doing that well at the tannery? Did someone die and leave them an estate? Or are they perhaps pretending? This tension created a strange culture of fashion policing, not by guards or inspectors, but by neighbors. By the woman behind you in the pew. By the boy delivering your firewood. By the elder who pretended not to glance at your hemline but absolutely noticed it. You could see it in the glances, the tiny frowns, the sideways looks during market day. Wear something just slightly off and you'd hear about it before you finished your ale. Oh, that's new, isn't it? What a bold color for this season. Didn't know we were doing lace edges now. Even the church seating chart reflected fashion status. Yes, there were charts. People were seated by age, gender, social position, and perceived piety. Someone who dressed modestly but neat might move up a bench. Someone who looked too proud might find themselves demoted, closer to the drafty door. Of course, not everyone accepted this quietly. There were always a few rebels. Quiet ones. The woman who lined her apron with hidden red thread. The man who wore boots an inch taller than necessary. The young couple who had matching cuffs and pretended it was a coincidence. These were subtle protests, dress code resistance, in a world of conformity. Some took it further. One record tells of a woman named Goody Ruth who wore a green shawl on purpose after being warned. She was fined and forbidden from wearing color for 6 months. Her husband, in response, wore the shawl to church the next Sunday. He claimed it was chilly. The elders disagreed. Eventually, enforcement became patchy. Smaller towns were stricter. Larger ones like Boston, a little looser. There were simply too many people, too many ships, too many fabrics flowing in. You could still be shamed, but you were less likely to be hauled before the court for a ruffled cuff. Still, the culture of distrust around clothing lingered. Because the real fear wasn't silk, it wasn't buttons, it wasn't lace or fringe or blue waistcoats. It was what those things represented: change, class mobility, the loosening of moral discipline. If people could dress how they wanted, what else might they start doing? Questioning sermons? Dancing on Saturdays? Choosing their own husbands? Scandalous. So you keep your cloak plain. You wear your bonnet a little tighter. You stitch your cuffs with brown thread instead of white. And you smile when someone mentions Thomas's blue waistcoat, but not too widely. Because even the smile might be interpreted. And in a society where modesty is law and public shame is fashion enforcement, the safest look is the one no one notices. Just blend in. Stay dull, stay safe. At least until the next gust of wind catches someone's garter. You're folding laundry, if you can call it that. 2 shirts, 1 petticoat, and a pair of stockings so stretched they might as well be scarves. As you smooth the linen, a thought drifts in. Who even decided what was proper to wear in the first place? Because by now, you've noticed something curious. The Puritan dress code wasn't just about religion, it was deeply political. Let's back up a moment. By the mid-1600s, New England was no longer just a collection of hopeful religious settlements. It was turning into something messier, a society, with governments, class systems, power struggles. And suddenly, clothing wasn't just a matter of modesty, it was a visible way to define your place in the pecking order. Take, for example, the town elders. They weren't elected for their sense of fashion, but it sure didn't hurt that they looked the part. A long, dark cloak, a hat with a conservative brim, a vest stitched by someone skilled but humble. These things said, I'm a man of order, I'm part of the ruling structure. I won't be wearing frippery, but I'll be watching if you do. Meanwhile, the wealthier merchants, the ones getting rich off rum, timber, and fur, had a different idea of how things should look. They had money, connections, access to English goods. And they weren't too thrilled about being told they had to wear drab brown coats just to prove their virtue. So began the quiet power struggle between wealth and authority. The merchant class wanted to dress like they'd made it. The ministers and magistrates wanted everyone to stay visibly humble, so no one forgot who really ran the place. Historians still debate how much the Puritan dress code was about faith versus social control. Some argue it was a necessary spiritual discipline. Others see it as an early form of class regulation where those in charge got to decide who looked too rich. Here's your odd fact. There were actual clothing exemptions written into law for certain people. A widow of a certain age could wear black silk. A town official might be allowed silver buttons. But a regular citizen who wore the same thing? Fine. These exemptions were written in dusty, careful language, but they boiled down to, we trust you not to be vain. Everyone else? Suspicious. This created some truly bizarre scenarios. Imagine 2 women in the market wearing the same shawl, one, the widow of a former magistrate. The other, the wife of a fisherman. One gets admiring nods. The other gets side eyes and maybe a warning from the deacon. Even color had political weight. Certain shades, deep green, wine red, rich gold, were associated with status back in England. Wearing them in the colonies, especially without reason, could be interpreted as trying to claim authority you didn't have. It was like turning up to a town meeting in a crown and asking if anyone wanted a cinnamon roll. And this wasn't just among adults. Children's clothing followed the same rules. A boy dressed too finely could reflect poorly on the entire family. One record from Salem describes a child whose coat was too richly dyed and the parents were fined. The dye? Onion skins and crushed blueberries, not exactly Versailles. But the pressure wasn't only from the top down, it also worked sideways. Neighbors watched neighbors, families monitored one another. Entire villages developed informal hierarchies based on dress. The family who always wore patched cloaks was upright, humble, God-fearing. The one who had matching gloves? A little proud, even hair became political. Men who let their hair grow long, think shoulder length or more, were considered suspect. Too vain, said the elders, too cavalier. It suggested influence from those English types, the royalists, the party crowd. A man in Boston once had his hair forcibly cut in public for wearing it like a poet. Brutal, women too faced endless scrutiny over how they styled their hair under their caps. Too tightly pinned, prideful, too loose, unruly, too much volume. Vane, a woman named Hester, was accused of teasing her hair to unnatural height using combs heated by the hearth. It's not clear what happened to her, but you can bet the sermon that Sunday had extra fire. Eventually, some began pushing back not with rebellion, but with subtle mockery. One minister, tired of being scolded for his starched collar, began wearing a slightly crooked one on purpose. A merchant's wife started sewing quotes from the book of Proverbs into her apron, mostly about humility and silence. It was technically legal and extremely pointed. You finish folding the last stocking. It's more whole than sock, but it will do. You tuck it into the basket beside the fire and sit back with a creaky sigh. And you think again about what your clothes say what they read aloud to say, and what you wish they could say. That you work hard, that you mend with love. That you've been here through every storm and Sabbath and sleepless night. That you deserve a little color, just one blue ribbon. Just one. But you won't wear it, not yet. Because in Puritan New England, clothing was never just clothing. It was a vote, a sermon, a boundary, and sometimes a trap disguised as linen. You wake before dawn. The air is cold. Your breath curls in front of your face like steam from a kettle. You fumble for your dress coarse wool, mend it at the seams, and layer it over your shift with half-frozen fingers. Then comes the bodice, the apron, the stockings, and finally your shoes hard, cracked leather with soles as thin as bark. You move slowly, methodically. Not because you want to, but because dressing like a proper Puritan woman takes time, and care, and attention to rules you no longer remember agreeing to. It's the last day before the town's quarterly inspection. The elders have been talking about it all week. A chance to review the moral comportment of households. Translation: someone will glance at your clothing and decide whether you've been a bit too proud lately. Let's call this what it really is, a social audit. In Puritan New England, everything about your clothes, how clean they were, how they fit, what materials they used, was evidence. Of faith, of obedience, of social alignment, of moral health. And today, as you walk into town past fences dusted with frost, it all comes together. Because dress wasn't just personal expression. It was communal regulation. A silent code everyone understood, even if no one dared admit it was there. A man with a perfectly polished buckle, ambitious. A woman with starched cuffs, prideful. A child with boots stitched by someone outside the village, dangerously influenced. What you wore spoke louder than what you said. And while many followed the dress code to avoid trouble, some internalized it so deeply that not following it felt like an act of violence. Historians still debate whether these social dress codes were rooted more in Calvinist theology or colonial insecurity. Were people genuinely trying to live modest lives? Or were they just terrified of slipping in the eyes of the only community they'd ever known? Probably both. And here's your odd fact. During at least one town inspection in 1673, a woman was marked down not fine, just noted for wearing a look of contentment in an overly fine bodice. Not even the bodice, the look. That's how fine the needle of judgment had become. In the town square, the elders gather near the meeting house steps. You can already feel their eyes scanning the crowd. You clutch your shawl tighter not out of shame, but strategy. It covers the faded embroidery at your neckline, a leftover from a time when you thought you could get away with a small red thread flourish. You're not alone in your self-editing. Around you, others adjust, hide, minimize. One man quickly rubs dirt on his new boots to dull the shine. A young girl tugs her bonnet forward to hide her bright cheeks. It's a dance everyone knows how to dress down just enough to pass. Not too humble, not too fine, just right, because fitting in isn't safety. It's survival. There's no fanfare, no parade. Just a quiet series of nods, murmurs, and side glances. The elders pass through the crowd. Names are recorded. A few people are gently pulled aside for a reminder on humility. No one cries, no one argues. Because everyone knows this is just the way it is. You breathe a little easier once they move on. You passed. But the relief is fleeting. Because you know you'll do it all again next season, next inspection, next whisper in the marketplace. The rules don't stop when the elders leave. The rules live inside the community, and now maybe inside you. You return home as the sun begins to rise over the tree line. Your fingers are cold, your shoes rub, but your clothes did their job. They hid the bright thoughts, they quieted the personality. They spoke the correct language. And tomorrow you'll wear them again. Because in the end, the confusing dress code of America's first Puritans wasn't just about fashion or faith. It was about belonging. And about the slow, steady stitching of identity through cloth, conformity, and quiet resistance. The fire is low now, only glowing embers remain. The room has quieted, wrapped in the hush that comes when even the wind outside has grown tired. Your clothing, your patched, plain, faithful clothing, is folded neatly at the foot of the bed. It smells faintly of wood smoke, soap, and winter. Tonight, you've walked through a world where fashion wasn't freedom, it was restraint. Where every buckle, every bonnet, every thread in a sleeve told a story you weren't always allowed to change. A world where looking too fine could earn you a fine, and dressing just right meant disappearing into the crowd. But behind every plain cloak was a person, someone who mended late into the night, someone who whispered while they stitched, someone who knew that even the simplest garment held the memory of labor, of choices, of quiet rebellion stitched beneath the hem. Now, as the candle gutters low, your breath slows. The weight of wool is replaced by the soft warmth of a blanket. The elders are gone, the court is adjourned. No one's watching anymore. You made it through the long day. You blended when you needed to. You remembered the rules. You wore them like armor. And now you can let them fall away. Because in the end, the thread that matters most is the one that ties you to yourself, to the small, steady defiance of surviving with grace in a world that asked for silence. Close your eyes. Let the stitches blur. Let the cold wind stay on the other side of the shutters. You've done enough. Good night, traveler of time.